Deep in the untamed wilds, where maps fade into myth and echoing gunshots barely dent the silence, the hunt holds a darker edge. Here, bears aren't just beasts, they're sentinels of ancient ground, testing every intruder with unblinking eyes and thunderous wrath. Hunters come seeking game, but some find themselves in a trial by nature where instincts clash and steel nerves are the only currency. These aren't chance encounters. They're rites of passage written in claw marks and blood. In these woods, survival isn't earned, it's demanded. A national park in south-central Alaska, 13.2 million acres of untamed wilderness, demanded respect from even the most seasoned outdoorsmen. The Chitina River Basin, with its densely forested slopes giving way to open river flats, represented some of the most productive hunting grounds in the entire state. In early September 2006, when the first hints of fall began painting the wilderness in amber and gold, Hank Tolliver made his annual pilgrimage into these untamed lands. Hank was no greenhorn. At 53, he'd been hunting Dall, sheep, and moose in Alaska's interior for over 3 decades. His weathered face, creased from countless days under the harsh northern sun, told stories of successful hunts and near misses that had earned him a reputation among the local hunting community. This particular season, Hank had decided to try something new, a sidearm to complement his trusted scoped .30, 06 bolt-action Remington 700. The Glock 20 and 10mm auto had been recommended by a fellow hunter who swore by its stopping power. He'd had a few distant encounters with grizzlies over the years, but nothing that had ever escalated to a genuine threat. Still, the stories of increasing bear activity in the area had convinced him to make the purchase. The first 3 days of his hunt proceeded without incident. Hank had established a comfortable base camp in a small clearing surrounded by black spruce and paper birch, about a quarter-mile from the river. His gear was meticulously organized, the tent carefully positioned with the door facing downwind, meat-hanging tree selected 50 yards from camp, and his Remington cleaned and ready each evening. He'd managed to take down a respectable bull moose on the second day, providing enough meat for his needs and some to bring back to his daughter's family in Anchorage. On the 4th night, everything changed. Hank had been processing the last of his moose meat when he first sensed something was wrong. The forest had fallen unnaturally silent. No chattering squirrels, no distant bird calls, just a heavy, waiting silence that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He'd been in these woods long enough to know what that meant. He moved quickly but calmly to secure his camp, hanging the remaining meat high in his designated tree and making sure his cooking area was clean. Throughout the night, he heard the sounds of something large moving through the underbrush around his camp. Occasionally, low, rumbling growls emerged from the darkness. Hank kept his Remington close and the Glock in his shoulder holster, sleeping fitfully as the unknown visitor circled his perimeter. The following morning revealed massive paw prints in the soft earth around his camp. The bear had been close, within 20 yards of his tent at some points. Worse still, it had made an unsuccessful attempt at his hanging meat cache, clawing at the trunk of the tree and leaving deep gouges in the bark. Hank estimated from the prints that he was dealing with a boar grizzly weighing at least 900 pounds, one of the largest he'd ever encountered. That night, Hank decided to remain awake, keeping watch by his small fire. Around midnight, the bear returned, this time bolder than before. It approached the edge of the firelight, its massive silhouette visible against the trees. Hank fired a warning shot from his Remington, and the bear retreated momentarily into the darkness. But it didn't leave. Throughout the night, it continued to circle, growing increasingly aggressive, making several feints toward the meat cache. By the 3rd night, Hank was exhausted. He decided to break camp the following morning, cutting his trip short by 4 days. But the bear had other plans. Shortly after midnight, as Hank dozed against his pack, the massive grizzly charged directly into camp. It tore through his tarp shelter in a frenzy of claws and teeth, sending his cooking equipment flying. In the chaos, Hank rolled away and drew his Glock. The bear turned, rising to its full height, a towering mass of muscle and fur silhouetted against the dying embers of his fire. Hank fired twice, hitting the bear squarely in the chest. The impacts barely registered. The bear dropped to all fours and charged again. Hank fired 2 more rounds, emptying his magazine into the charging beast. The 10mm rounds, which had been promised to stop any North American predator, Might as well have been bee stings to the enraged grizzly. It kept coming, seemingly unaffected by the shots. In desperation, Hank blindly reached into his emergency kit and grabbed his marine flare gun, a safety precaution he carried for signaling in case of emergency. As the bear closed the final distance, Hank fired the flare directly into its neck. The magnesium flare ignited against the bear's fur, sending it into a panicked retreat. The wounded animal crashed through the underbrush, disappearing into the darkness with roars of pain and confusion. Hank didn't wait for morning. He packed his essential gear and hiked through the night, navigating by headlamp until he reached the Forest Service road where he'd left his truck. It was the first time in 30 years he'd abandoned a hunt. Back in Anchorage, Hank couldn't shake the experience. The Glock 20, which gun store experts had assured him would stop any bear, had failed completely. 4 direct hits to the chest hadn't even slowed the massive grizzly. After that season, Hank never again went on solo hunts, always bringing at least one partner. He also traded in his Glock for a .454 Casull revolver, though he couldn't help but wonder if even that would have made a difference against the beast he'd encountered. When asked years later about that night, Hank would simply say that the bear hadn't been after his food. In his gut, he believed it had been testing him, challenging his presence in its territory. It was a realization that haunted him far more than the physical danger had, the understanding that in those remote wilds, humans were not necessarily at the top of the food chain. A national forest in the western part of Montana stretched across more than 2.4 million acres of pristine wilderness, offering a vast landscape of untouched natural beauty. Its dense pine forests, alpine meadows, and crystalline lakes had long been a haven for both wildlife and hunters seeking solitude. In September 1997, the forest was particularly vibrant. Early autumn had painted the aspens golden, while the lodgepole pines maintained their deep emerald hue. This transitional season brought elk down from higher elevations, making it prime hunting territory. Caleb Drexler had been coming to these woods since he was 12, first with his father, then alone, and now with his cousin Samuel "Sam" Weatherford. At 43, Caleb considered himself a seasoned woodsman. He'd harvested dozens of elk from these mountains, knew the best ridge lines for glassing valleys, and could read animal signs like others read newspapers. Caleb carried his trusty Weatherby Mark V in .300 Winchester Magnum. Excessive for elk perhaps, but comforting in grizzly country. Sam, less experienced but enthusiastic, clutched his Remington 700 in 7mm .08, a lighter caliber that Caleb had gently mocked. They'd left their base camp at 4:30 that morning, hiking nearly 3 miles by headlamp to reach a promising spot before dawn. Recent scouting trips had revealed abundant elk sign, fresh droppings, torn bark where bulls had rubbed velvet from their antlers, and the unmistakable oval depressions of bedding areas. The cousins moved silently across the forest floor, their boots making little noise on the carpet of pine needles. By mid-morning, they'd found exactly what they were looking for: fresh elk sign that couldn't have been more than hours old. The scat was still moist, and several small trees showed recent bark damage where a bull had likely been working his antlers. Caleb signaled to Sam, pointing toward a rocky outcropping that would give them an elevation advantage. From there, they could gaze at the adjacent valley where elk would likely graze in the meadows below. The climb was steep but short. As they set up their spotting scopes and binoculars, Caleb felt a familiar thrill. The temperature was perfect, cool enough that the elk would move throughout the day rather than bedding down. The wind direction was favorable, carrying their scent away from the valley. It was, by all measures, a textbook setup. An hour passed with nothing but squirrels and a lone mule deer doe. Caleb was adjusting his scope when Sam's hand suddenly gripped his forearm. Caleb looked up, following Sam's wide-eyed gaze toward the tree line about 80 yards away. What he saw made his blood run cold. A massive grizzly bear stood motionless at the forest edge. Its silver-tipped fur caught the morning light, giving it an almost ethereal appearance. Caleb estimated it at well over 600 pounds, a mature boar in his prime. But what made Caleb's skin crawl wasn't the bear itself. It was what stood beside it. Next to the grizzly was a figure that, at first glance, appeared human. It stood upright, approximately 6 feet tall but impossibly thin. Its pale skin was stretched over a gaunt frame, giving it an emaciated appearance. The figure wore nothing, completely naked despite the autumn chill, and its feet were bare against the rocky ground. Its face was turned away from them, seemingly focused on the same valley the hunters had been observing. Neither man spoke, neither dared move. For what felt like minutes but was likely only seconds, the tableau remained frozen, two hunters watching a bear and a humanoid figure that defied explanation. Then, as if sensing they were observed, both the bear and the pale figure turned their heads simultaneously toward Caleb and Sam. The pale figure's face remained shadowed, but its eyes caught the sunlight, reflecting it back like polished metal. In perfect synchronicity, both creatures stepped backward into the forest and vanished between one heartbeat and the next. No branches moved, no sound was made. They simply disappeared. Caleb realized he'd been holding his breath only when his lungs began to burn. Sam's hand was still locked on his arm, fingers white-knuckled. Without discussion, both men packed their gear with shaking hands. The valley and its elk no longer held any appeal. They abandoned their carefully chosen vantage point and headed back toward camp, moving much faster than prudent hunters should, frequently looking over their shoulders. The remainder of the day passed in tense silence. Neither man wanted to give voice to what they'd seen. When they reached camp, Caleb busied himself reinforcing their small fire pit with rocks, while Sam checked their food cache, hung safely in trees away from their sleeping area, standard precaution against bears. Though neither mentioned the pale figure, both had their firearms within arm's reach at all times. Night fell earlier than usual as clouds rolled in. The cousins ate their freeze-dried meals without appetite, the forest around them seeming darker and more hostile than any wilderness Caleb had known before. Around midnight, the sounds began, methodical crunching circling their campsite, heavy breathing just beyond the firelight's reach. Something large paced the perimeter, stopping occasionally as if to listen. Caleb clutched his Weatherby, finger resting near the trigger guard. Sam remained motionless in his sleeping bag, eyes wide open, reflecting the dying embers. The sounds continued for hours. Just before dawn, when the forest was at its darkest, a different noise caught their attention. A soft, almost whispering sound that seemed to mimic human speech patterns without forming actual words. It came from directly above their tent. Neither man looked up. When first light finally broke, Caleb was the first to exit the tent. 20 yards from their campsite, a massive ponderosa pine bore fresh claw marks that stretched nearly 10 feet up its trunk, far higher than a normal grizzly could reach while standing. More disturbing were the barefoot human prints that circled their entire campsite, interspersed with massive bear tracks. The human prints were deep at the heels but shallow at the toes, as if whatever made them walked with an unnatural gait. The cousins packed up without speaking, leaving half their gear behind in their haste. Only when they reached the trailhead and the safety of Caleb's truck did Sam finally break the silence, asking what Caleb thought they had seen. Caleb had no answer then, and 25 years later still had none. He never returned to that part of the forest, telling friends and family that the area was overhunted or played out. In private, however, he simply referred to it as the place where man and bear share trails in ways they shouldn't. Caleb Drexler still hunted, but never alone, and never in places where dense forest met open valleys. He avoided Montana entirely after 2002, moving his annual hunting trips to the more open country of eastern Wyoming. When asked why, he would simply say that some places weren't meant for people, not because of the bears, but because of what walked beside them. The Yukon Territory in late October 1983 was a land transformed. The vibrant autumn colors had faded, replaced by the stark monochrome of early winter. Frost-covered tundra stretched toward distant mountains, their peaks already snow-capped. Near Whitehorse, where the Takini River carved through rolling hills, the landscape balanced precariously between seasons, not yet buried in winter's deep freeze but no longer hospitable to unprepared travelers. This transitional period marked the end of moose season, a final opportunity for hunters to secure meat for the long winter ahead. Eli Pritchard was not a man who embraced change easily. At 62, his weathered face bore the marks of 4 decades spent trapping and hunting in the Canadian wilderness. His hands, gnarled from years of setting snares in sub-zero temperatures, still maintained remarkable dexterity when fielding his firearms or skinning game. Eli had always relied on his bolt-action Remington 700 in .30.06, a simple, reliable rifle that had served him through countless seasons. But this year, his son-in-law had convinced him to try something different. The Browning Bar .308 semi-automatic lay heavily across Eli's shoulders as he trudged through 3 inches of fresh snow. The unfamiliar weight distribution irritated him almost as much as the synthetic stock that remained cold to the touch, unlike his Remington's comforting wood. Still, he had to admit the lighter recoil would be easier on his aging shoulder, and the quick follow-up shots might prove useful in the dense brush where moose often bedded down. Eli had arrived at his cabin near the Taquini River 3 days earlier. The small one-room structure had been his hunting base for nearly 30 years, though he visited less frequently now that arthritis had begun to stiffen his joints. His first 2 days had yielded nothing, only old moose tracks and the occasional grouse. Today, he'd decided to push farther northwest toward a series of small ponds where late-season bulls sometimes gathered. The morning had been uneventful. Eli moved slowly, stopping every 50 yards to scan the landscape with his binoculars. He'd spotted several sets of moose tracks, but they were at least a day old, heading deeper into the brush. By noon, low clouds had moved in, bringing with them sparse, stinging snow flurries. Eli decided to circle back toward his cabin, taking a different route through a stand of alder scrub that bordered the open tundra. It was there that Eli noticed the fresh tracks cutting across his path. His heart quickened as he knelt to examine them. Not moose, but unmistakably bear. The prints were massive, at least 8 inches across, with clear claw marks extending several inches beyond the toe pads. Grizzly tracks, and fresh enough that snow had not yet accumulated in them. Eli straightened, suddenly aware of how quiet the landscape had become. No birds called, no squirrels chattered. The alders stood unnaturally still in the windless afternoon. Eli chambered around in the Browning, the unfamiliar action making what seemed like an obscenely loud click in the silence. He considered backtracking, but calculated that his cabin was less than a mile ahead. Continuing forward would be faster than retracing his steps across open terrain. He'd taken no more than 20 cautious paces when the alders to his right exploded outward. A massive grizzly sow burst into view, ears pinned back, mouth open in a silent charge. Later, Eli would estimate it stood nearly 8 feet tall on its hind legs, with a distinctive blonde streak running from its shoulder to its haunches. But in that moment, all he registered was movement, mass, and threat. Eli raised the Browning with practiced speed, sighting quickly on the center of the charging bear. He squeezed the trigger. Nothing happened. He squeezed again. Still nothing. The unfamiliar rifle had jammed, perhaps from the cold, perhaps from the unclean factory grease he'd neglected to remove, or perhaps simply from the cosmic humor that targeted stubborn old men who refused to properly maintain new equipment. In the microseconds that followed, Eli's options vanished. The bear was less than 15 yards away and closing rapidly. Desperation rather than calculation guided his next action. Eli hurled the useless rifle directly at the charging grizzly, the 7-pound Browning spinning end over end before striking the bear squarely in the snout. The unexpectedness of the projectile momentarily confused the sow. It halted its charge, batting at the rifle with one massive paw while Eli seized his opportunity. He threw himself sideways down the slight incline that bordered the alder thicket. His body hit the snow-covered ground and began to roll uncontrollably down the slope. Sharp pain exploded through his left side as his ribs impacted against a half-buried log. Eli tumbled nearly 30 yards before coming to rest against a stunted spruce. Pain radiated through his chest with each gasping breath. Above him at the top of the slope, the grizzly sow stood over the discarded rifle, sniffing at the foreign object with obvious confusion. For a terrifying moment, its small eyes locked with Eli's. Then, to his astonishment, it batted the rifle once more with her paw, snorted loudly, and turned away, disappearing back into the alders as suddenly as it had appeared. Minutes passed as Eli lay motionless, afraid the slightest movement might draw the bear back. When he finally dared to sit up, waves of pain confirmed what he already suspected. At least 2 ribs were cracked, possibly broken. His left side blossomed with rapidly spreading bruises beneath his heavy wool shirt. Yet he was alive, his skin unbroken by the claws and teeth he had been certain would end him. The half-mile trek back to his cabin took nearly 3 hours. Each step sent jagged pain through his torso, and twice he had to stop to rest, propped against trees, fighting waves of dizziness. His mind kept returning to the Browning, now likely buried under fresh snow at the top of the slope. The rifle had failed him, yet in its failure had saved his life, a paradox that would give him much to consider during his recovery. Eli's all-terrain vehicle waited where he'd left it that morning, half a mile from his cabin. The ride back over uneven terrain was excruciating, each bump and dip sending fresh spasms through his damaged ribs. By the time he reached the cabin, darkness had nearly fallen and the temperature had dropped well below freezing. That night, as he lay wrapped in blankets beside his wood stove, Eli penned a short note in the journal he'd kept for decades. October 28, 1983, Taquini River, Browning jammed, bear confused, ribs broken, lesson learned. Eli Pritchard recovered slowly, returning to Whitehorse 2 weeks later when the pain had subsided enough for him to make the journey. X-rays confirmed 3 fractured ribs and a small crack in his scapula. The injuries healed eventually, though the damaged ribs would trouble him in cold weather for the rest of his life, a persistent reminder of his encounter. The following autumn, Eli returned to his cabin for moose season. In his pack was his old Remington 700, meticulously cleaned and oiled. He never again used a semi-automatic rifle, nor did he ever recover the Browning. Sometimes on return trips to the Taquini, he would scan the alder thickets, half expecting to see a grizzly with a blonde streak carrying a rifle like some bizarre trophy. He would tell fellow hunters at the lodge in Whitehorse that he'd learned an important lesson that day. If you don't clean your gear properly, a bear'll do it for you. The story always got laughs, though Eli never mentioned how close death had come, or how the sound of snapping twigs could still wake him from deep sleep decades later. A national forest sprawled across southeastern Alaska like a verdant labyrinth. 17 million acres of temperate rainforest where Sitka spruce and western hemlock lined the shorelines and climbed the mountain slopes. In July 2012, the forest brimmed with life as the first salmon runs began, bringing with them the bears that depended on this annual feast. Near Hoona, where the forest met the sea, streams ran thick with pink and chum salmon, their silver bodies flashing in the clear, cold water as they fought their way upstream to spawn. Marcia Bellows hadn't planned on visiting Alaska that summer. At 36, the former Army medic had settled into a comfortable routine back in Michigan, working at a veterans clinic and fishing local lakes on weekends. But when her brother Winston invited her to join his annual salmon fishing trip, something in his description of the pristine wilderness called to her. Though she'd seen combat in Afghanistan and considered herself level-headed in crisis, nothing in her military training had prepared her for what awaited in the forest. The siblings had set up camp near a productive stream about 12 miles from Hoona. Their first 2 days had been remarkably successful. They'd already filled half their cooler with fresh salmon. Winston, an experienced angler who had fished these waters for nearly a decade, knew exactly where to find the best spots and which flies to use. Marcia, though less experienced with salmon, quickly found her rhythm and landed several impressive fish. On their third morning, they'd woken before dawn and hiked to a promising bend in the stream where Winston had experienced success in previous years. The fishing was excellent, and by mid-morning, both had caught their limit. As they prepared to clean their catch, Marcia realized she needed to answer nature's call. She told Winston she'd be back in a few minutes and headed into the woods, seeking privacy. The dense understory of Devil's Club, blueberry bushes, and ferns quickly obscured her brother from view. Marcia walked about 100 yards from the stream, found a suitable spot, and took care of business. It was only when she turned to head back that she realized she'd lost her bearings. The uniformity of the massive spruce trunks and the thick undergrowth disoriented her. What should have been a simple walk back became increasingly confusing as she tried different directions, unable to hear the stream over the constant dripping of moisture from the canopy. After 15 minutes of increasingly anxious searching, Marcia decided to climb to higher ground, hoping to spot the stream or hear her brother's voice. She scrambled up a small rise, pushing through the wet undergrowth. At the top, she paused to catch her breath and survey her surroundings. That's when she felt it, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Slowly, Marcia turned. 30 feet away, partially obscured by a fallen nurse log, stood a massive brown bear. Later, she would describe it as a coastal brown bear or grizzly, standing nearly 7 feet at the shoulder. Its fur was dark, almost black in the forest's green filtered light. What struck her most was its eyes, intelligent and focused entirely on her. The bear made no sound, no huffing, no jaw popping. None of the warning signs she'd been taught to watch for during their pre-trip safety briefing. Marcia didn't run. Her military training had taught her that much at least. Running triggered predatory instincts. Instead, she began talking calmly while slowly backing away. The bear didn't charge. It didn't stand up or swat the ground. It simply watched. And then, most disturbingly, it began to follow her. For the next hour, the bear shadowed Marcia through the forest. When she walked, it walked, maintaining a distance of about 30 feet. When she stopped, it stopped. The behavior defied everything she'd been told about bear encounters. It wasn't aggressive, but its silent persistence terrified her more than a charge would have. Several times she tried to scare it off, shouting, waving her arms and throwing sticks in its direction. The bear merely watched these displays with what she would later describe as something like curiosity. By mid-afternoon, Marcia had traveled what she estimated to be over 3 miles, though in what direction she couldn't be sure. The constant presence of the bear prevented her from concentrating fully on navigation. Her water bottle was nearly empty, and the cool dampness of the forest had given way to an uncomfortable chill as her clothes became soaked with sweat and the ever-present moisture of the rainforest. At one point, Marcia climbed a rocky outcrop, hoping the bear wouldn't or couldn't follow. For 20 minutes, she huddled there, watching the forest below. Just as she began to hope the bear had lost interest, she spotted it, circling the base of the outcrop, methodically investigating each possible approach. Its patience was more unnerving than any aggression would have been. When the bear found a root up and began to climb, Marcia abandoned her position, sliding down the opposite side of the outcrop and pushing through a nearly impenetrable thicket of devil's club. The plant's spines tore at her clothing and skin, but fear drove her forward. When she emerged from the thicket, the bear was already there, waiting, not blocking her path, but watching, following. As daylight began to fade, panic set in. Marcia knew that spending a night in the forest with the bear shadowing her would be dangerous at best, fatal at worst. Desperate, she began zigzagging through the trees, changing direction frequently, trying to confuse or lose the animal. The strategy only seemed to intrigue it further. The bear adapted to each change, sometimes appearing ahead of her rather than behind, as if it anticipated her movements. Just before dusk, when Marcia's strength was nearly spent, she heard the most beautiful sound imaginable, human voices calling her name. The search party her brother had organized was nearby. Marcia shouted back, her voice cracking with emotion. As the voices grew closer, she looked back. The bear had vanished. One moment it had been there, silently padding after her. The next it had melted into the forest without a sound. The search team, 2 local guides and her frantic brother, found Marcia minutes later. She was dehydrated, scratched from countless encounters with undergrowth, and bordering on hypothermia despite the relatively mild temperature. They wrapped her in emergency blankets and began the trek back to camp, listening with growing concern as she described her silent shadow. At first light the next morning, 2 experienced guides from the search team returned to the area where they'd found Marcia. What they discovered confirmed her story and added to its strangeness. Bear tracks, massive ones, circled and crisscrossed her trail repeatedly. The pattern was unlike anything the guides had seen before, not hunting behavior, not territorial marking, but something else entirely. In places, the bear's tracks appeared ahead of Marcia's footprints, as if it had indeed been anticipating her movements, circling around to watch her from different angles. The search team estimated that the bear had followed Marcia for nearly 7 miles through extremely difficult terrain. Not once had it charged or shown aggression, yet its relentless presence had been a form of psychological torment that left deeper scars than any physical attack might have. Marcia Bellows recovered physically from her ordeal within days, but the psychological impact lingered. She never returned to Alaska, and her occasional fishing trips back in Michigan were limited to popular, well-trafficked areas. She refused to enter forests alone, insisted on carrying both bear spray and a satellite phone whenever she ventured into wildlife areas, and developed a heightened sensitivity to being watched, even in urban environments. Years later, when asked why she thought the bear had followed her, Marcia would shake her head and say she had no answer. Local Tlingit elders from Hoona offered one possible explanation. that Marcia had unknowingly crossed through an ancient and still respected boundary within the forest, one that humans were not meant to cross alone. The bear, they suggested, hadn't been stalking her but escorting her, ensuring she found her way back to where she belonged. Whether this was true comfort or cold terror, Marcia could never decide. The Bitterroot mountain range stretched along the Idaho-Montana border like a jagged spine, its peaks rising over 10,000 feet into thin, crisp air. Glaciers had carved steep valleys and high basins throughout the range, creating isolated pockets rarely visited by humans. In December 2001, heavy snowfall blanketed the region, transforming it into a silent, pristine wilderness. Higher elevations received nearly 4 feet of powder, accessible only to the most determined travelers. Travis Moore had explored the Bitterroots since childhood. At 38, he was a local legend in Hamilton, Montana, renowned for finding game where others failed. Though a sought-after guide, he preferred solitary hunts after the commercial season ended. This trip began as a late-season deer hunt with 2 friends, Reginald "Reggie" Calder and Philemon Whitaker. They set out from the Bass Creek trailhead, snowshoeing into remote terrain, hoping to find bucks in the high basins and return before the next storm. But the storm came early. On their second day, as they glassed a basin, dark clouds surged over the western peaks. Snow began falling hard before they'd covered a mile. Visibility dropped to 20 yards, winds howled, and temperatures plummeted. Even Travis struggled to navigate through the whiteout. Nightfall found them off course, trudging through thigh-deep snow. Then Reggie spotted a dark shape in the swirling snow. Closer inspection revealed a cabin, isolated in a clearing and partially shielded by fir trees. It looked decades old, weathered logs, a sagging porch, a single unbroken window. Oddly, the door opened easily and warm air drifted out. Inside, a small iron stove glowed red. Someone had been there recently. A table, 3 chairs, a narrow cot, and military blankets suggested it was still in use. Then they noticed the walls. At least a dozen bear skulls were arranged in careful patterns. Below them, crude pictographs, stick figures beside bear shapes, covered the logs. On the table lay a notebook, its latest entry dated just 2 days prior in December 2001. They watch from the tree line every night now. Soon they will invite me to join them. The offerings have been accepted. The storm left them little choice. They decided to stay the night, taking turns on watch. Philemon, once an anthropology student, studied the pictographs and noted similarities to Salish and Kootenai symbols. Travis took the first watch, seated near the window with his rifle. Outside, the storm raged. As snow piled against the glass, he watched the darkness, certain that something watched back. Around midnight, the scratching began. It moved along the roof, then to the door, then around the cabin. Not random, methodical. Travis woke the others without a word. For nearly an hour, they sat in silence, listening as the sound circled them again and again. Peering through the snow-blinded window revealed nothing. Then it stopped. Morning brought relief. The storm had passed, but no tracks surrounded the cabin, no sign of what had scratched through the night. Travis urged immediate departure. Reggie skimmed more pages of the notebook. Earlier entries were detailed observations of bear behavior, but the final pages grew increasingly strange. Descriptions of communion and shared consciousness with bears, and the repeated phrase, "watching from the tree line." They left everything as they'd found it and snowshoed out under clear skies. Mid-afternoon saw them regain a familiar ridge. They spoke little until safely back in town. That evening, over beers in a Hamilton tavern, Travis contacted a Forest Service ranger to ask about the cabin. The ranger was puzzled. That cabin, he said, had burned to the ground in a lightning-caused fire in 1984. No structures were ever rebuilt in that basin. Travis Moore never returned to that part of the Bitterroots. He continued hunting, but never again beyond marked trails. Those who knew him best said he'd changed after that trip, quieter, more cautious. Years later, after Travis passed away, his grandson found a journal among his things. In it, carefully pressed between the pages, was a torn leaf from a notebook, spidery handwriting, faded but legible. They still watch from the tree line, but now I understand why. Kodiak Island existed in the Alaskan imagination as a realm of giants. In November 1992, as the island transitioned from fall to winter, Gerald "Jerry" Matheson, a 49-year-old petroleum engineer from Anchorage, finally fulfilled his boyhood dream of hunting there. He was joined by his 24-year-old son, Lawrence. After arriving 2 weeks earlier, they spent their initial days acclimating and preparing at a lodge near Akiok before venturing into remote terrain. Their main target was the Sitka blacktail deer, smaller than mainland deer but prized for their meat and the difficulty of the hunt. Jerry carried a Weatherby Mark V in .300 Winchester Magnum, excessive for deer, but chosen for bear country. Lawrence had a Remington 700 in .270, lighter but still formidable. By the 10th day, they had taken 3 blacktail bucks which hung from a game pole near their spike camp. The meat was cooling in the autumn air, ready for pickup the next day by a chartered float plane. That morning dawned unusually clear, though their guide, Vance Thorington, warned that visibility could change quickly. They set out early, hoping to harvest one more deer. The terrain was challenging, but they spotted a promising buck in a small clearing. After a careful stalk, Lawrence dropped it cleanly with a shot through both lungs. They field-dressed the buck efficiently, but as they worked, fog began to roll in. By the time they finished, visibility had dropped to less than 50 yards. Vance urged a quick return to camp. They suspended the deer between them on a spruce pole and began the slow trek back. Halfway to camp, Vance raised his hand. "Stop." He pointed toward a rocky outcrop. At first, Jerry saw nothing. Then out of the mist emerged a massive Kodiak brown bear. It moved with surprising grace, unaware of their presence. But then the wind shifted. The bear sniffed the air and locked eyes on them. They slowly lowered the deer carcass. Vance whispered for them to back away, but the bear began advancing. Jerry raised his rifle and fired a warning shot. The bear paused, then rose to its full height, nearly 10 feet tall. It stared for a moment, then dropped to all fours and stepped forward again. Jerry fired a second warning shot. The bear didn't flinch. At 25 yards, Vance gave the order to take the shot. Jerry aimed between the bear's eyes and fired. The bullet hit dead center, but the bear only shook its head. Blood trickled down its face, but it kept coming. Jerry chambered another round and fired again. Same result. Lawrence fired. Then Vance's shotgun boomed. Still the bear didn't stop. Jerry emptied his rifle, 5 rounds, each one perfectly placed, each one useless. At 15 yards, the bear stopped. It sniffed the air. For nearly a minute, no one moved. Then, without a sound, the bear turned and walked back into the fog. No one spoke. When the bear was gone, Lawrence let out a nervous laugh. Vance, a seasoned guide, admitted he'd never seen anything like it. Jerry stood frozen, rifle limp in his hands. They left the deer behind and returned to camp in silence. Once there, they packed quickly and radioed for early extraction. The forest no longer felt like a place they belonged. Back in Anchorage, Jerry resumed hunting, but only in the Chugach Range, where bullets behaved as they should. He never fired the Weatherby again. In time, he came to believe that certain places operated by different rules glimpsed only when the fog grows thin. Kodiak Island, he decided, was one such place, wild, beautiful, and unknowable.